They said she didn't belong, that she was just a headline waiting to happen, that women didn't lead SEALs, they followed them. And yet, there she stood, boots buried in the cold sand of Coronado Beach, waves slamming against the California coast like the pulse of something ancient. Her name was Lieutenant Julia Navarro, and before the sun would rise twice, every man who doubted her would remember that name. If you believe that strength has no gender, that grit doesn't care what uniform you wear, like and subscribe. And while you're at it, tell us where you're watching from, because this one, you'll want to remember. It started with a whisper, the kind that crawls through barracks and classrooms before the ink on a name tag is dry. She's not one of us. They said it when she walked into orientation, her duffel slung over one shoulder, her jaw set like someone who'd already survived what they only trained for. 28 years old, Army combat medic turned candidate for the toughest unit on Earth. She wasn't supposed to be there, not by their standards, not by tradition. But Julia didn't ask permission from tradition. She'd buried it with her brother 3 years earlier in a flag-covered coffin. The first morning, the recruits lined up by the edge of the surf, wind cutting through their fatigues. The Pacific was black and endless, swallowing moonlight and courage alike. Chief Instructor Hardin, a man carved from salt and suspicion, paced in front of them. His eyes landed on Julia for half a second longer than anyone else. That was all it took. She could feel the judgment before he spoke. "Ladies and gentlemen," he barked, "by Friday, half of you will quit. The ocean doesn't care if you're strong. It just waits to find out who's weak." A few smirks rippled through the line, eyes darting toward her. She didn't move, didn't blink, didn't give them the satisfaction of reaction. That night, when the others laughed and complained in the mess hall, Julia sat alone, her tray untouched, her notebook open. In the margin, she wrote 3 words, for Daniel. "Finish this." The page beneath it held a photo. Her brother, a SEAL, smiling under a desert sun, sand dusting his gear. The ink below the picture was faded now, but she still knew every letter. "If you ever find your way here, remember, pain is just proof that you're alive." At dawn, the waves were crueler, the drills harder, the laughter louder. When they were ordered to haul 200-pound logs across the beach, one of the men accidentally let his end drop early. Julia's shoulder hit the sand with a crack. She bit back a sound, stood, and lifted again. Not a word, not even a glance. "She'll quit by nightfall," one of them muttered. But she didn't. She stayed until the horizon bled orange and her hands tore open, then wrapped her palms with tape and kept running. They didn't see the years behind her, the field hospitals, the gunfire, the patients she'd dragged from burning trucks in Kandahar. They only saw the woman in the wrong place, too calm, too quiet, too different. And when she didn't break, they got meaner. Sand in her boots, salt in her canteen, a whisper campaign that she was only there because of optics. Every insult, every half-laugh chipped away at something soft inside her, but underneath that softness was steel. She carried it in silence. Instructors took notice, though they didn't admit it. Chief Hardin would watch from a distance, arms crossed, expression unreadable. During log PT, when most recruits begged for mercy, Julia never did. She moved with the stubborn rhythm of someone who'd already made peace with suffering. When exhaustion hit, she would glance at the ocean, not as an enemy, but as a test. You can't fight the sea. You endure it. By week 4, the unit had stopped being indifferent. They'd started being defensive. "She's making us look bad," one hissed during chow. "She's got help, that's all," another said, though no one could say from whom. Julia didn't have help. She didn't have friends. But she had something they'd forgotten. Purpose. Every time the cold bit deeper, every time her lungs screamed for air, she whispered the same words under her breath. "For Daniel. Finish this." Hell Week came like judgment. The kind that strips away bravado and leaves only truth. Recruits collapsed. Some cried. Some vanished before sunrise. The beach swallowed names faster than the waves. And through it all, Julia kept going. Her hair matted with salt water, her lips cracked and bleeding, her eyes bloodshot but alive. Hardin watched her stumble out of the surf at dawn, her uniform plastered to her skin, her arms trembling. She was shaking, barely holding her gear. But she smiled. It wasn't pride. It was defiance. "You think you've proved something?" Hardin said quietly, walking beside her. She didn't answer. He studied her face for a moment longer, then muttered, "Keep moving." By the end of Hell Week, only 12 remained from 40. Julia was one of them. The others avoided her gaze now, not out of disgust, but confusion. She wasn't supposed to make it this far. The whispers stopped. The laughter died. But the silence was heavier than either. On the final night of that phase, as the recruits huddled around a dying fire, one of them, a man named Carter, looked across the flames. "Why are you even here?" he asked. His tone wasn't mocking this time. It was tired, human. Julia stared into the embers for a long moment before answering. "Because my brother didn't come home," she said softly. "And someone has to finish what he started." No one spoke after that. When morning came, she was first on the beach again. The sun broke across the horizon, and for the first time, Chief Hardin didn't call her Navarro. He said, "Lieutenant." The others noticed. Respect wasn't spoken, it was earned. Quietly, painfully. Julia would go on to pass BUD/S, then Advanced Combat Diver Training, Sniper Qualification, Halo School. Her body bore the marks of each one. Her reputation followed. Rumors of the woman who never complained, never quit, and never sought the camera. They called her Ghost. But before she could lead, before she could wear that trident with honor, she had to face one last truth. The military doesn't forget what it once doubted. And that truth would come for her soon enough. Because the same men who once laughed at her would one day hear her voice on the radio, steady and commanding, echoing across a battlefield half a world away. And when that moment came, they wouldn't just remember her name. They'd follow it. The ocean was cruel that night. The kind of cruel that stripped paint off steel and courage from the unprepared. By the second phase of SEAL qualification, the recruits were no longer fresh-faced volunteers. They were ghosts in training, half-starved, half-mad, all desperate. And among them, Lieutenant Julia Navarro moved like a shadow, quiet and deliberate. The same precision she once used to stitch bleeding soldiers in sandstorms. The instructors had stopped calling her names, but that didn't mean the men had stopped watching. Respect had turned to resentment, the kind that festers in silence. When one of them slipped a handful of sand into her rifle chamber during weapons maintenance, no one said a word. When her rations mysteriously went missing before a 20-mile march, she didn't complain. She just marched. 20 miles became 22 after a navigation error. Still, she finished. It wasn't the pain that got to her, it was the eyes. The way they looked through her, like she didn't belong in the same uniform. Every stare reminded her of the nurse who once told her mother, "Your son died a hero. Your daughter just followed orders." Julia learned early that people see what fits their story, not what stands in front of them. So she stopped trying to explain herself and started building her own story, one act of silence at a time. That week's test was a cliff descent, an exercise in precision, teamwork, and endurance. The cliffs loomed like black teeth against the moonlight, waves crashing below, wind cutting through the harnesses. Chief Hardin barked orders from the ridge, his voice slicing through the roar of the surf. 4-man teams. No mistakes. You slip, you die. You fail, you start over. Move. Julia checked her gear twice, 3 times. The rope felt alive in her hands, slick with sea spray. She was paired with Carter again, the same man who once questioned why she was there. He didn't look at her now, just muttered, "Don't slow me down." She didn't reply. They descended fast. The line swayed under their combined weight, water spraying upward like shards of glass. Halfway down, lightning flashed over the horizon, bright, violet. The wind shifted, the rope jerked. Carter lost footing, boots scraping against wet rock. His harness lock jammed, the safety not slipping an inch too far. Panic shot through his voice. "Rope's caught. I'm stuck, wait." Then the sound, snap. His safety line tore loose. Carter swung out over the void, his scream ripped away by wind and thunder. For a heartbeat, Julia froze. Then instinct took over. She unclipped from her safety rope and went after him. Hardin's voice exploded over the radio. "Navarro, hold position. Do not move." But she was already gone. Her gloves shredded as she rappelled down the secondary line, every muscle screaming. Carter hung 15 feet below her, his body jerking, rope unraveling strand by strand. She didn't think. There wasn't time to think. She swung herself sideways, slammed against the cliff, reached down, and caught the end of his harness just as the last fiber snapped. The jolt nearly ripped her shoulder from its socket. Carter dangled below her, gasping, eyes wide with disbelief. "You're insane," he shouted. "Shut up and climb," she hissed. It took them 10 minutes to reach the bottom, but it felt like hours. When they hit solid ground, Carter collapsed in the sand. Julia checked his harness, her shoulder throbbing, her breath ragged. The radio crackled again, Hardin's voice, low and dangerous. "Team Bravo, report." Carter reached for the mic, but she stopped him. "Don't," she said quietly. "They'll pull you from the course." "You just saved my life," he snapped. "And if you tell them that, they'll drop us both." When they returned to base, drenched and shivering, Hardin's eyes narrowed. "What happened out there?" "Equipment malfunction," Julia said evenly. He studied her face for a long moment. "You'll have a hearing in the morning." They both knew what that meant. Disciplinary review. Insubordination. Potential disqualification. She saluted, silent. Carter started to speak, but she shot him a look that stopped him cold. The hearing was short. Hardin read the report, eyes flicking between the pages and her face. "You broke protocol," he said. "Yes, sir." "You could have died." "Yes, sir." "You disobeyed a direct order." She didn't answer. He leaned forward, voice quieter now. "Why?" Julia met his gaze. "Because he was falling." For a moment, something flickered across Hardin's expression, something almost like respect, but it was gone as quickly as it came. "You'll take a 1-week penalty and repeat the exercise." "Yes, sir." Dismissed. That night, when the others slept, she sat alone by the docks. The waves whispered against the pylons, soft and steady, like breath. She pulled the photograph of her brother from her pocket, its edges worn and salt-stained. "You'd laugh at this, Danny," she murmured. "You tell me to play by the rules. But you never saw a man fall and look the other way." By dawn, the story had already spread through the base. Some called her reckless. Others called her something else, fearless. Carter didn't speak about it. He didn't need to. The way he looked at her during drills said enough. Weeks passed. The training grew harder. Live fire simulations, underwater demolitions, survival tests in open sea. Recruits came and went, but Julia stayed. When she failed, she learned. When she succeeded, she said nothing. It wasn't about winning, it was about lasting. Then one morning, a black SUV pulled up beside the training field. Out stepped a man in uniform, so clean it gleamed. The recruits froze. His presence carried weight, authority, and history. Rear Admiral Cole, head of SEAL Operations Command, was a myth in flesh. He spoke briefly with Hardin, then turned toward the trainees. His eyes landed on Julia. "You Navarro?" "Yes, sir." He nodded once. "Walk with me." They stood by the shoreline as the others watched from a distance. The Admiral's gaze was fixed on the horizon. "You disobeyed orders to save a man's life," he said. "You know what that makes you." "Undisciplined," she replied automatically. He smiled faintly. "Human." He paused, studying her. "You're not the first to be doubted here. But you might be the last to prove them wrong this completely." She didn't know how to respond. He turned to face her fully. "Finish the course. Then report to Special Operations Command. We've got a team forming. Alpha Group." Her heart stopped. Alpha, the elite of the elite. No one from training went straight there. No one. "Why me?" she asked quietly. "Because you didn't save a man to make a point," he said. "You did it because it was right. That's leadership." And just like that, he walked away. The following weeks were a blur of exhaustion, precision, and silence. Every recruit who had once mocked her now followed her example, whether they admitted it or not. She became the standard, the one who didn't break, the one who didn't need applause. When graduation day came, she stood at the edge of the platform in her dress uniform, the weight of the gold trident gleaming against her chest. Hardin approached, holding her file. "I was wrong about you," he said simply. She gave him a small nod. "No, sir. You were right. I just changed the answer." He smiled, almost proudly. "Don't waste what you've earned." As she turned to face the line of new operators, the wind whipped across the field, carrying the faint scent of salt and smoke. Somewhere beyond the horizon, she knew her brother would have been smiling too. And though none of them could see the future that morning, every man in that graduating class would one day hear her voice again, clear, calm, commanding, on the other end of a combat channel. The voice of the woman they once called not one of us. The same voice that would one day lead SEAL Team Alpha. The war had a way of stripping away pretense. Out there, No one cared about quotas, headlines, or gender. Only survival. Only command. 2 years after that last dawn at Coronado, the name Commander Julia Navarro carried weight in places where sunlight never reached. SEAL Team Alpha, 12 men who had seen everything, answered to her voice. And they did it without hesitation. The mission was supposed to be routine, escort a convoy through the narrow valleys of Nuristan province. But routine died quickly in places where the mountains swallowed sound. When the first explosion hit, dust and fire tore the sky apart. The radio crackled with static, panic bleeding through every frequency. Convoy 2 down. Multiple hostiles, ambush. Julia's voice cut through it like steel through smoke. All teams, defensive positions. No one moves until I say. Calm, measured, unshaken. The same voice that once took orders from men who thought she didn't belong now commanded them under fire. She didn't yell. She didn't panic. She led. Hours blurred. Air support delayed. Ammunition running low. Then silence, the kind that comes before the next wave. Her second in command, Chief Petty Officer Miller, leaned against the ridge, his arm bleeding. We're surrounded, he said. Julia checked her map, her jaw tight. Not surrounded, she corrected softly. Encircled means opportunity. She ordered 2 flanks to draw enemy fire while she and 3 others maneuvered through a ravine. When they emerged behind the attackers, her rifle spoke with precision and finality. By dawn, the valley was quiet again. The radio was alive with one phrase: Alpha secure. All accounted for. When the dust settled, the men of Team Alpha didn't look at her like an anomaly anymore. They looked at her like what she was, their commander. Weeks later, back at Coronado, the same base where she had once been mocked, word of her mission reached every corridor. Her name wasn't whispered anymore. It was spoken with reverence. Chief Hardin, now training a new batch of recruits, stood by the shoreline when the black transport SUV rolled up. He didn't need to check the manifest. He knew. She stepped out in full uniform, the sunlight catching the gold trident on her chest. Her hair was shorter now, her face sharper, older in the way that only combat could carve. Hardin saluted first. The recruits froze. No one spoke. Commander Navarro, Hardin said quietly. Welcome home. She returned the salute, eyes steady. Thank you, Chief. He gestured to the new recruits lined up by the surf, struggling under the weight of their packs. They could use a word, he said. She nodded and walked toward them. The air was thick with the scent of salt and sweat, just like it had been that first morning years ago. The recruits straightened, uncertain. She looked over them, young, raw, full of ego and fear. For a moment, she saw herself standing there again, the outsider. Some of you think you're here to prove how tough you are, she began, her voice calm but carrying. Some of you think this is about strength, or pride, or legacy. It's not. It's about who still stands when none of that matters. She paused, scanning their faces. When you're cold, hungry, and alone, when the ocean takes everything you thought made you special, the only thing left is purpose. If you don't have that, you'll quit. If you do, you'll never need anyone's permission to lead. The recruit said nothing. The waves broke behind her, steady and endless. She looked back at Hardin. Keep them honest, she said. He smiled faintly. You taught us how. Later, as the sun dipped low, Julia stood alone by the training pier, the same spot where she had once written her brother's name in the sand. She reached into her pocket and unfolded the worn photograph. The edges were frayed now, the ink faded, but the face still smiled back at her. She whispered, We made it, Danny. Behind her, footsteps crunched against the wood. Chief Hardin approached, holding something small, her old notebook. Found this in the archives, he said. Didn't seem right for it to gather dust. She took it, thumbing through pages filled with notes, scribbles, fragments of her old life. At the very back, she'd written a line she didn't remember writing. Respect is earned when no one's watching. She smiled faintly. Guess I was always talking to myself. Hardin nodded. And now, everyone else listens. As night fell, the base lights shimmered against the ocean. New recruits ran along the shoreline, shouting cadence into the wind. And somewhere in that rhythm, every chant, every push-up, every breath, the story of Lieutenant Julia Navarro lived on. Not as a symbol, not as a statement, but as a standard. They still tell her story at Coronado. The instructors say it during orientation week. There was once a recruit who didn't belong. Now, she commands the ones who never thought she could. The recruits always ask if it's true. The answer is always the same. Look toward the horizon. Because sometimes, if the morning light hits just right, you can see a single figure walking the beach alone, boots in the surf, the ocean bowing at her feet. And even the wind seems to whisper her name. Julia Navarro, the one they said wasn't one of them. The one who came back leading them all.